Today's Tuesday Second Chance is going to be a little bit different from past editions. The first difference is we're not going to look at just one case. We're going to look at two very similar cases. And the reason we're going to look at them is to be able to compare and contrast them. In details, they're actually almost identical, but in outcomes, in what happened, they're very different. And it's worth looking at these cases to understand why the outcomes were so different. The second thing, which is a little bit different from usual, is that whereas in past cases, we have tended to look at cases that have happened quite some time ago, and therefore we have the luxury of being able to view them at a distance. Today, we're going to look at two relatively recent cases, one of them which happened just a few months ago. And the reason why we're looking at these cases so quickly is because we feel that there are important lessons learned which need to be captured and passed on to others in the maritime security community. Today's topic is maritime piracy. And I'm well aware that in today's audience, there are many individuals who are real experts on this topic, who've been involved for many, many years in counter-piracy efforts and have a very deep and wide knowledge of the topic. And I'll be looking forward very much to hearing their input and their views on this particular subject. We are going to look at two individual piracy incidents which took place off the coast of the African continent. And these are two separate cases, one which took place off the east coast of Africa and the other which took place off the western coast of Africa. And as I've said, these two particular cases are actually quite similar in their detail, but very different in their outcome. And what we're going to try and identify are those key events and surrounding factors that made these outcomes so different. And one of the most important of these is the legal environment in which the two particular cases were conducted. From this, I'd like to take the opportunity to discuss with you to identify which were those critical issues, and more importantly, how do they apply to other international, transnational maritime crimes? Not just piracy, but things like drugs trafficking, things like the smuggling of persons, the trafficking of weapons. So there are lessons here which are not only relevant to the issue of piracy, but clearly have implications much further afield in relation to other maritime security challenges that we face. We'll begin by moving immediately to the first incident which we're going to look at. And this particular incident involved the French Navy ship Sirocco, which is a landing platform dock, an amphibious warfare ship, and which at the time of the incident was actually the flagship of EU NAVFOR Atalanta, which was the EU's counter-piracy operation off Eastern Africa. The story begins on the 17th of January of 2014, where a tanker, the MV Nave Atropos, reported that it was under attack by suspected pirates. And this report went to the UK Maritime Trade Operations Unit in Dubai. This is a Royal Navy organization tasked with receiving information from both commercial vessels and military vessels and disseminating that information to a variety of users in order to provide awareness of pirate activity in that particular region at the time. The Nave Atropos was carrying a privately contracted armed security team, and these were actually able to repel the attack which was being made. And they also observed that the small boat being used by the pirates then moved away from their vessel towards a nearby dhow which was drifting in the area. The dhows, as you all know, are the typical small trading vessels of this region. In response to this, thanks to international coordination, Two units were dispatched to search for this dhow, which was now suspected of being a pirate mothership. These two units came from CTF 151, which, as many of you probably know, is the counter-piracy operation of the Combined Maritime Force, which is a coalition of maritime actors who are operating in this particular area. So CTF 151 is their counter-piracy operation. The two units which were dispatched were the Japanese ship Samidare, which is a Japanese Navy frigate, and also a Japanese maritime patrol aircraft, which was land-based. And these were sent out in an attempt to find this suspected mothership. The ship was actually relatively quickly located, both by the maritime patrol aircraft and by a helicopter which was dispatched from the French frigate. However, the closest naval vessel to that suspect vessel was not the Japanese frigate. It was actually the French landing platform ship, Sirocco, which, as I mentioned, was the flagship of EU NAVFOR Atalanta at the time. And because of the excellent cooperation of the various international navies who were operating in the area, a request was made and accepted that Sirocco proceed to this suspect vessel and intercept it. And in fact, they managed to intercept it the next day, and they launched their helicopter and boarding team, who approached this vessel. And during the approach towards the vessel, they saw the people on board the vessel dumping a number of suspect objects into the water. These appeared to include weapons as well as objects such as boarding ladders and so on. There was no resistance to the boarding team proceeding aboard the dhow. So the French boarding team managed to board the dhow without there being any active resistance from any of the persons on board. On board the dhow, they found the master and the crew of the dhow, who had been taken hostage, and their vessel had been used as a mothership by pirates, or suspected pirates in this case, and 5 individuals who were suspected of being the pirates themselves. The master of the dhow confirmed that these 5 individuals were the same persons who had attempted the attack on the tanker the previous day. Clearly, these 5 individuals were taken into custody, whereas the legitimate crew of the dhow was released from their imprisonment on board the dhow and allowed to take command of their vessel again. On the basis of a bilateral agreement concluded between the European Union and the Seychelles in 2009, it was decided that these 5 suspects would be transferred to the Seychelles in order to be tried. Now, in response to this agreement, which had been made with the European Union in 2009, in 2010, the Seychelles had made some significant changes to their national laws related to piracy. And this was done with the intention of being able to support the prosecution of any pirate suspects arrested by any international forces from across the region. Making this arrangement clearly had not been easy for the Seychelles. It had caused them a significant burden. They had had to train prosecutors specifically for this task. They had had to set up juridical facilities and penal facilities to support this process of being able to try these suspects. So this was actually a very significant and burdensome step by the Seychelles. There was some external support from other countries in helping them establish these mechanisms, but Seychelles should be significantly congratulated for stepping up in this case and providing their legal system as a basis for the prosecution of these suspects. And in fact, in this case, the case came to trial in 2016, and all the 5 accused were found guilty on 2 counts of piracy, and they were all sentenced to 12 years of imprisonment. The information I have is that imprisonment was being served in the Seychelles rather than these individuals potentially being transferred back to their country of origin to serve their sentences there. So you can see here we have a case of piracy to which the response has been quick and efficient, in which there was significant international cooperation, both between international navies as well as between countries in the region. And the result of that is that we have seen that very rapidly individuals are placed into an appropriate legal system, given an appropriate legal proceeding, and that proceeding is relatively swiftly brought to an end and concluded. And there are pre-existing agreements which smooth this whole process. Not so in the second case, which we are going to briefly look at. And you are all probably aware of this particular case. It caused significant attention from the international media. And this is the case of Her Danish Majesty's ship Esben Snar, which is a Danish multi-purpose ship. They're called frigates sometimes they're called multi-purpose vessels. But for the sake of this particular discussion, we'll call her a frigate. And this frigate was dispatched in late October of last year, of 2021, to conduct patrol activities in the Gulf of Guinea. Now, it's important to point out that this was a purely national deployment. This was not part of a wider structure. This was a part of Danish government efforts to provide security in the region and to provide a visual deterrent to piracy activities in the region. You may ask why Denmark was so keen on doing so. And the simple answer is that Denmark, although a relatively small country, is a maritime superpower. The amount of ships which are owned by Danish owners, operated by Danish operators, or that sail under the Danish flag is immense. It's estimated to be perhaps up to 1/5 of the global fleet. So you can understand that Denmark has a significant interest in ensuring that commercial vessels are able to proceed on their voyages safely, efficiently, and without interference. They estimated, in fact, that there were around 40 Danish-operated ships which were sailing daily through that region. And when I say Danish-operated, it means either they were under the Danish flag, they were owned by Danish owners, they were operated by Danish operators, or they were chartered by a Danish company to carry their cargo. So they clearly had a significant interest in ensuring security in this particular region. Exactly 1 month later, on November the 24th, the Esben Snar was heading towards the port of Tema in Ghana, which is where this red circle is here on the map. At the time, the Esben Snar was approximately here in the Bight of Benin. And they received information that there was possible pirate activity in the area. In response, the commanding officer of the frigate decided to launch his onboard helicopter to conduct a surveillance flight. And in fact, the helicopter detected a small boat with either 8 or 9 persons on board. It's still not clear, and we'll discuss this a little bit later. And this small boat was maneuvering in the area where there were a number of merchant vessels either drifting or navigating, which was an area about 25 to 30 nautical miles outside the territorial seas of Nigeria. The crew of the helicopter also reported that on board this small boat, they had seen objects including ladders and possible weapons. So these were all indicators that the persons on board this particular small boat were engaged in the boarding of other vessels, and therefore they were potentially pirates. The commanding officer of the frigate then decided to approach this vessel and intercept it. And two small boats were deployed from the Esbensnar with armed teams on board, and they proceeded towards this suspect small boat. A number of verbal and visual warnings and requests to stop were given. However, the persons on board the suspect craft chose to ignore these. In response, the Danish forces on board the small boats fired a number of warning shots to indicate that the persons on board the boat were to stop immediately. And the reports that are available indicate that the response to these warning shots was that the persons on board the suspect craft opened fire directly at the Danish personnel. The Danish Navy personnel responded with return fire and deadly force. This turned into an extended small arms engagement, and at the end of this engagement, the Danish personnel approached the small boat and found 8 persons on board, 4 of whom had been killed due to the exchange of fire, 1 of whom had been wounded, and 3 who were still uninjured. There was some information that there was potentially a 9th person on board this craft who may have gone overboard during the engagement. However, until today, that information remains unconfirmed. So the 4 survivors of this particular incident were taken into custody by the Dutch forces. They were detained on board the Esbjerg, and in the days that followed, the Danish authorities attempted to find a coastal state that was ready to accept and to try these suspected pirates. This was complicated by the fact that, as I said, one of these individuals was wounded, and it was a significant injury. In fact, it led to him having to have a major amputation while still on board the Esbjerg, which fortunately was equipped with an operating theatre and appropriate medical staff. But it was found that in order to ensure that this individual received appropriate medical care, he would have to be transferred ashore. And in fact, Ghana accepted to have this individual transferred ashore to provide that further medical care. However, in the case of the other 3 individuals who were still in detention on board the frigate, because there were no prior agreements between Denmark and any of the coastal states, Denmark found themselves unable to transfer the remaining suspects for eventual prosecution. You may ask, why did they not take these individuals back to Denmark to prosecute them there? Well, in addition to the logistical challenges of that, there was also the fact that Danish law is not particularly well adapted to trying pirate suspects. It had not been prepared and had not been amended, for instance, in the same way as the Seychelles law, to prepare for this type of prosecution for an act which happened so far away from Danish territory. As a result, we saw something that we hadn't seen since 2009, 2010 on the other coast of the African continent, the so-called catch and release. The 3 suspects, although suspected of being engaged in pirate acts, were released from custody, placed in a small boat, given sufficient stores to reach land, and released at sea. Therefore, no further legal action was taken against them. The 4th suspect, however, was, to all intents and purposes, still in Danish custody, although he was ashore in Ghana. And therefore, the Danish authorities had little choice but to transport him to Denmark. He has been accused not of any piracy offences, but attempted manslaughter due to his use of weapons against the Danish forces. And his lawyers are arguing, well, you let the other 3 go. Why are you taking our client to court? And therefore, it still remains to be seen how successful this prosecution will actually be. So if we compare the two cases, we can see that the case involving the French ship Sirocco took place in an area where there was a high degree of international cooperation. In comparison, the Esbern Snar was operating in an environment where the degree of international cooperation was relatively low. There were no pre-established agreements. In fact, when we look at prior coordination, we can see that in the case of the French vessel, it was able to leverage established agreements which were already in place. The agreement which had been concluded between the European Union and, in this case, Seychelles. And it's also important to point out that the Seychelles was not the only country in the region that had made such arrangements. For instance, Kenya had also concluded similar arrangements with a number of countries and organizations. So not only was there one option, potentially there were two options for the prosecution of individuals in that region. In the case of the Esbern Snar, there were none, which is quite surprising when you consider that the Danish forces and the Danish government already had considerable experience off the east coast of Africa and the importance of these arrangements. The jurisdiction which both of them used, both the crew of the Sirocco and the crew of the Esbern Snar, was identical. It was international law which provides for the interception of pirates on the high seas and universal jurisdiction over piratical acts. In the case of adjudicative jurisdiction, the French were able to use the Seychelles domestic law, which had been carefully amended to ensure that Seychelles courts had jurisdiction over these cases. In the case of Esbern Snar, they had an existing domestic piracy law, which was inadequate, and no coastal state which was ready to accept the suspects. And the outcomes could not have been more different. In the case of the Sirocco, the case ended with a successful trial and conviction of the suspects. In the case of the Danish frigate, we see 3 suspects being released and an inability to prosecute the 4th suspect for the crime of piracy. He is accused of a different crime, and it is unclear how successful this prosecution will actually be. So to summarize, although very similar in their nature, these 2 cases had very, very different outcomes. The counter-piracy actions, which were conducted in a cooperative environment, and that is from both the operational as well as legal perspective, resulted in successful convictions. A similar action conducted where there was no cooperation framework resulted in the release of the suspects, as well as diplomatic and legal difficulties. There were a number of statements from coastal states around the Gulf of Guinea who objected to the manner in which the Danish had conducted their operation, who criticized the Danish government for the manner in which this operation had been conducted. So this operation did not only not result in the appropriate legal steps being taken against suspects, but it also caused difficulties for the Danish government and their relations with the coastal states in that particular region. And this obviously leads to a number of questions which need to be asked about this type of case. The first question is, how good are we at cooperating across our region? Not only for piracy, because I know in the particular region where many of you are based, the international cooperation against piracy is actually extremely good, because it has been an issue which has been addressed at many levels over a significant period of time. But there are other transnational crimes which will pose the same challenges to what we can and cannot do at sea. Crimes like the smuggling of narcotics and weapons, the trafficking and smuggling of persons, the smuggling of protected wildlife or wildlife products. So, do we have the right regional cooperation mechanisms in place to allow us to address these effectively? What about our communications channels? Are they set up for one particular issue? Are they only useful for cases of piracy? Or do we have channels of communication that can support cooperation across the spectrum of threats? Because it depends on who's talking on those particular channels. If you are addressing the issue of the trafficking of wildlife, then having only navies talking to each other is clearly going to be insufficient. You need wildlife protection agencies on that channel exchanging information. They are the specialists in this particular subject. So we have to make sure not only that the channels exist, but that the right people are on that channel making the exchanges. And the third issue, which we perhaps need to think about, is how good are our domestic legal instruments? I pointed out in this particular, in the first of the case studies, how the Seychelles had to amend their domestic laws to make sure that they became adequately prepared for that regional cooperation. Similar measures had to be taken also in Kenya. And, for instance, Nigeria has also drafted its new Maritime Security Act, which came out in 2019, with an eye on this regional cooperation and this ability to conduct legal proceedings against persons who were not necessarily arrested by Nigerian forces or in Nigerian territory. But how many countries have actually done that? In this case, Denmark has not, because they never perceived a need to be able to do that. Now perhaps there will be a rethink. So these are three of the potential issues which I'd like to discuss with you. I will now stop the screen share at this point in time. So starting from the first, when it comes to our regional cooperation mechanisms, are we prepared to conduct regional cooperation on issues, not just piracy, but other ones, other transnational challenges? Do we have those structures in place? I'm opening the floor to anybody who wishes to either put up their hand or open their mic, and I'm happy to listen to your comments and remarks. Mr. Mutrafi, am I correct in you wanting to make a comment?
Not just.
Okay, thank you. So is there anyone else who wants to make an intervention or a comment on this particular issue of our regional cooperation mechanisms? Do they exist? How good are they? How can we improve them? Do we know how to interact with our international partners? Because when a case actually happens, we very rarely have the luxury of being able to sit down and start thinking about how we're going to talk to someone. We have to have practiced this and exercised this. Are we ready at short notice to immediately get in contact with our counterparts in another agency or in another state in order to be able to cooperate with them? These are questions which sometimes are not easy to answer because we don't know what the answer is. But they are issues that we have to address if we want to be effective in our cooperation against these issues. As you can see, by not establishing these arrangements, the Danish finished up in a situation which was uncomfortable and perhaps even embarrassing. It does not look good when a navy, after arresting suspects, then puts them on a small boat and sends them off without any further penalty or sanction. So it's very, very important that these cooperation mechanisms are in place before the event. What about our legal structures? Are our legal structures ready to address these issues? For instance, a simple question: can the courts in your country proceed against the person who has been arrested outside your territory? It sounds like a simple question, but you will find that in many countries, unless a person has either been arrested within the territory or by an agent of the state, i.e. the Navy, Maritime Police, so on and so forth, you may find that unless that is the case, the courts are unable to proceed on prosecuting and trying the case against that individual because they deem that they do not have jurisdiction. And that's very, very common in many legal systems. So what about our legal system? Is it ready to take this challenge? Can our courts exercise that jurisdiction over persons who have been arrested outside our territory? Persons who have been arrested by the Navy of another country or by the Coast Guard of another country? Again, looking at this issue when these people turn up in court is unfortunately too late. We need to think and design our systems that they are ready and fit for purpose before this event happens. Here I would give the example, which I've already mentioned, of Nigeria. The Nigerian law, the Maritime Security Act of 2019, which was written on the basis of very wide consultation, both within Nigeria as well as with international partners and experts. That law has been drafted in a manner that makes it extremely flexible and also empowers the Nigerian courts to act in cases where before they would not have been able to act. So if anybody is looking for an example of a legal code which has been drafted with this very problem in mind, this ability to exercise jurisdiction over cases outside territory, this ability to exercise jurisdiction over cases where national agencies were not involved, then I would strongly recommend taking a look at the Nigerian Maritime Security Act of 2019, because it is an extremely well drafted and well designed piece of legislation. And it gives them the ability to be able to act over a wide range of cases which wouldn't normally have been the case. But what about in your countries? Is this code ready? Is this legislation ready? Are we aware of how prepared our legislation is? Who should we be talking to find out if our legislation is adequate and ready? And how do we go about changing that? Also like to mention cooperation and channels of communication. It's very important that in order to be able to conduct regional cooperation, we are able to talk across the region. And it sounds like a simple thing, being able to talk, picking up a telephone perhaps, but sometimes making formal communications between agencies or between states requires that we establish specific communications channels where we know who we are talking to and that that person we are talking to has the authority to take decisions and has the authority to make things happen as required by our cooperation. So if we don't have these things in place, then it can be extremely difficult to conduct that effective cooperation. We have to have these communication channels in place. And these communication channels have to be established. They can't be set up when a case happens. That's too late. They have to be established channels which exist all the time, and normally where we conduct a simple communications check every day. But then when we need them, we know that the right person is on the other end and ready to listen and speak and communicate and interact. So making sure that we establish these channels and maintain these channels is extremely important. So again, I'd like to open the floor to anybody out there who would like to make a comment or input. You can also do it through the chat if you'd rather not speak. And we'll discuss the comments which you put in the chat. In fact, I've just said that and somebody has done exactly that. So, negotiation channels, laws. Yeah. It's being mentioned that willingness of the cooperating partners is important, and that the legal framework has to favor the states who are involved in this particular issue. And that's true. There has to be a great willingness of the countries themselves. A country will generally be willing to engage in these discussions and engage in these interactions if they are affected by those issues. So you really have to look at who are the interested parties, and like that, you can bring them on board. I described why Denmark is so interested in the Gulf of Guinea. If you look at where Denmark is, and you look at where the Gulf of Guinea is, at first glance, there doesn't seem to be an apparent link. But because Denmark has such massive maritime interests, there is in fact a link. And as pointed out, you have to look at those countries who have the willingness to engage, and they will generally be those countries who have some sort of link. We're also hearing from Mauritius. They have the Piracy and Maritime Violation Act of 2011. So again, here we see that another country has in 2011 enacted legislation which is accurately aimed and designed at piracy. And you'll find this across the globe, strangely enough, that from about 2009 onwards, states began to rewrite their maritime piracy laws because of the increased threat of piracy and pirate acts in the Western Indian Ocean. And up until then, many of the laws to do with piracy, in some cases, were even hundreds of years old. At least tens of years old, but some cases hundreds of years old. And they were not fit for purpose in the modern world or to support the cooperation that was required. So my country, for instance, Malta, we had to rewrite our piracy provisions in 2009. In fact, prior to 2009, in our legal code, piracy did not exist as a crime. So this was added in 2009. We see Mauritius here in 2011 enacting their Piracy and Maritime Violation Act. We see Nigeria enacting new legislation in 2019. So this new legislation has been very much a response to a real threat. And unfortunately, countries are very lazy, to put it that way, and only tend to enact new legislation when such a threat comes up. So it's very interesting to see how countries have reacted over this time frame in enacting their legislation. Another point which is being raised by my colleague Marianne Perron-Deraz regarding legal finish is that having legislation is important, but having also the infrastructure, the legislative infrastructure, the penal infrastructure, including, for instance, penal facilities, jails, is also a significant challenge. And I mentioned this in reference to the first case study. The Seychelles having offered their courts as a venue for the prosecution of these pirate suspects. Similar case in Kenya. Both of these countries then faced significant challenges to provide the appropriate detention facilities, court facilities for these suspects to be tried and detained appropriately. There was a degree of assistance from the international community in doing so, but you have to understand that this was a significant burden on these two countries, who had no obligation to provide this venue for the prosecution of pirates apprehended across the region. And therefore, we're actually providing a important and meaningful service to the international maritime community. And therefore, it's important that if a country does step up to provide and offer this ability to try suspects in a particular region, it's important that simultaneously they are given the support to be able to do that. This support needs to be technical, but this support also needs to be financial. It's an expensive business to run a detention facility. You have to have the facility itself, the staff, and so on and so forth. So for a country which does not need this burden, shouldering this burden can be something which is not needed and which is excessive and above and beyond their normal requirements. So providing that support to the country, both technical as well as financial support to the country, which has stepped up to provide this service to the community, is extremely important. So I think that's a very, very important point from Marianne. We need to help those states who are showing the leadership and the ability to be able to provide these venues and these locations where piracy suspects, or perhaps suspects of other crimes, as we move forward with international cooperation, may be tried and detained. So thank you very much for those comments on the chat. I'm not sure if there are any further comments which you'd like to put into the chat, or if anybody would like to take the floor live on the microphone. If you do, just put up your hand or just switch on your mic and you can begin talking. So there's nobody at this time. I'm open to more comments within the chat if you wish to make them. So today's cases, as I said, very, very similar in their detail. Both of them involve navies from outside the region engaging in the suppression of suspected piracy, not intervening directly in a piratical act, but identifying a suspect vessel, approaching that vessel, boarding that vessel, in one case without resistance, in the other case, unfortunately, with significant resistance, apprehending the persons on board, and then that is where the two cases diverge. In the case of the Sirocco, where good regional cooperation was in place, where established agreements with the Seychelles were in place, then this led to an appropriate legal finish and prosecution of the pirate suspects. In the case of the Esbensnar, because there were no pre-existing agreements in that particular region, unfortunately, it became impossible to pass those three suspects to a legal system for trial, and it resulted in them being released. And in the case of the fourth suspect, because Danish law was not adequately prepared to try a pirate suspect apprehended thousands of miles away from the state, then unfortunately, that also resulted in this individual not being tried for piracy, but for a different crime, and with no guarantee that that prosecution will be successful. So we can see how the differing circumstances in which almost identical operations were conducted resulted in extremely different outcomes, one of which you could consider a successful outcome, the other which perhaps is considered a less successful outcome. And this is not intended as criticism of the Danish efforts. This is just intended as food for thought to help you prepare yourselves, your states, your agencies for these challenges as you may face them in the next few months, years as we move forward. So are there any other comments within the chat or any other online interventions which you would like to make at this time? No. So if not, I would then have to ask you for your patience in perhaps switching on your cameras, those of you who are able to do so. The reason for this is to allow our communications specialist, Isabel, to take a screenshot of the participants for our publicity materials. So I'll be really happy to see as many smiling faces, preferably smiling, not bored. Yes, smiling faces as I could. So those of you who do have a camera, please do switch it on. Excellent. Isabel, I will pass over to you for the usual coordination of the
Je
picture.
suis là. I'm here. So good morning and thank you once more, Andrew, for your excellent presentation.
Pleasure.
And thank you also, Abdul Kader, who is, for those who are listening, French. And so I will make a screenshot, even if it is a lot of Crimario colleagues there. And so it's done. And,
thank you, Isabel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who attended today. Thank you for your participation. Special thanks to those people who put their comments in the chat and animated the discussion. Very pleased to have you all here. I hope you found this edition of Tuesday Second Chance engaging and useful. And I look forward to meeting you all again in a future edition of this particular webinar. So have a good remainder of the day, all of you. Please keep safe. And we look forward to having you again here for Tuesday Second Chance in a few weeks' time. Have a great day. Thank you very much.